Tēnā koutou katoa, bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue, haere mai, welcome to everyone joining us virtually and here in the room in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington, New Zealand. Welcome to Christchurch Call Co-Chair and New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. My name is Stacey Kirk, I will be your MC today. And today is an opportunity to ask the Prime Minister about the collective work of the Christchurch Call community to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. The second anniversary Leaders Summit of the Christchurch Call has just concluded. We have a refreshed work plan, so I will move straight on into how this call will work, this conference will work. Shortly I'll hand you over to the Prime Minister. We will then roughly have half an hour for questions. Some of you have already submitted questions, so if I call on you, please unmute, ask your question and then mute again. For those of you in the room, you are prepped to stand at the point so that the broadcast can see you and ask your question. Everyone, please keep your cameras off and remain muted unless we have called on you. If you would like to submit a question while the media conference is underway, please use the direct message function in the MS Teams chat. You can DM the Christchurch Call media team. You'll find them at the top of the participants list. Click on the circle icon and submit your question using the following format: your name, your media organisation, and then your question. If we don't manage to get through every question today, I can assure you my Christchurch Call colleagues will follow up with you individually. And now I will hand over to the Prime Minister for your first thoughts.
Thank you, Stacey. And kia ora koutou katoa, bonjour, welcome. I will be very brief in making some quick introductory remarks in conclusion to try and summarise what occurred in the summit we held this morning. I think my first comment would be that, to me, the fact that 2 years after that initial piece of work, the fact that we continue to see such momentum around the Christchurch Call and activity is notable. We had there today, 14 leaders, leaders from tech companies, alongside them a total of 120 members on the call and significant leaders within our civil society advisory network. That also is part of what I find extraordinary about the Christchurch Call work. I've been a part of many different forms of dialogue as a leader here in New Zealand, but this is the really only forum in which I can recall you have sitting alongside one another, making equal contribution and equally accountable world leaders, tech companies, members of civil society. I think that is both one of the strengths of the call, but also one of the things that makes the work so invigorating and also challenging. The reason it's been designed in that way is because we've very clearly held the view from the outset that we would not achieve the outcomes of the Christchurch Call and indeed prevent future atrocities such as what we experienced here on March 15 unless we work together. These issues will not be solved solely with regulatory fixes. And so I was heartened today by the conversation that was had, the work plan that we have to take us forward over the next 12 months, which is extensive, and in particular, the fact that there's really a common view of some of the areas that we need to continue to work on, of which I imagine we'll touch in our questions today. So those are a few introductory thoughts and comments from me.
Great, thank you, Prime Minister. We'll go straight to the question and answer portion. And first up, we will have Patrick Gower online, but from New Zealand news outlet News Hub. While Patrick is asking his question, Nick Perry in the room will take his place to ask his. Patrick, over to you.
Yes, Prime Minister, we know that the mosque terrorist has admitted that he was radicalised by YouTube, and we also know that he was a fan of the likes of Stephen Molyneux, who used YouTube to his advantage. Now, in terms of the algorithms which drive people through this kind of content that can radicalise them, has there been any progress made on that, given the fact that there are, of course, no laws that can govern these internet companies, and indeed these internet companies make their money through the algorithms? Have you been able to make any progress on some way of controlling the algorithms so we don't radicalise people like the mosque terrorists?
Thank you for the question. Well, the first thing I'd say is that, the commercial arrangements or the way in which platforms generate income and the way they use algorithms in that sense will be diverse. And so I should really acknowledge that up front. The second thing I would say is that, you do, on the call, from the core membership, you see a view that, the existence of algorithms themselves is not necessarily the problem. It's whether or not they are being ethically used. And so there, I'd say that is probably the biggest focus for the core community over the next year, or at least one of the biggest focus alongside expanding the network itself. We kept coming back through all of the sessions to this issue of algorithms, but I heard from the contributions from tech companies, the likes of Facebook, Dailymotion, Twitter, Microsoft, a real desire that within the settings we've already set for ourselves, which is this work doesn't have to undermine those proprietary issues. Let's have that conversation around the ethical use of algorithms and how they can be used in a positive way and for positive interventions. Because it's not just about whether or not they're driving users, it's whether or not they're driving users into a negative space. And we can flip that and turn it into a much more positive intervention. Coming very briefly, if I may, to positive interventions, there was talk of how can we ensure that those positive interventions are evidence-based, that we are sharing best practice. That's another area of work for the work program over the next year. And final thought, when we look at the environment in which the terrorist for March 15 was radicalised, even in that period, in those 2 years, there has been significant change by many of the platforms that may have been implicated through that period. We touched on a few of those changes today, but we did also try and cast forward, and I can tell you, algorithms is where many of us are looking to.
Thank you, Patty. Here in the room, we have Nick Perry from the Associated Press.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Without China, Russia and other jurisdictions signing up for the Christchurch call, how do you hope to stop the flow of extremist content that comes through those jurisdictions or might be hosted on platforms that are in those jurisdictions? And what other countries or participants would you hope would join up with the call and perhaps have a realistic chance of joining up with the call?
Thank you. A good question, because there was a big focus on how we could expand the community. And when I say that, I mean not just country membership, but the participation of tech companies, and we're really looking for diversity there. It's not simply a question of scale and solely targeting the largest. We do want that diversity of voice. We want diversity from our technical advisory group, being part of that core community network, and of course civil society. So we are looking to expand membership, but actually we seek to determine who is able to join simply by those who are able to commit to the principles of the call. So we haven't sat down and written a list of core countries that we would target. Simply it is open to those who can commit to those principles. The second point I'd make, just in reference to the individual countries you've named, is that actually here we're focused on the engagement of different platforms. Of course, then in a way it becomes country agnostic, because many of those platforms will be working across different countries, different jurisdictions, and if we can embed some of this work and principles for those companies, then by default we have that influence in the way that they're operating, regardless of country. The final point that I'd make is that one of the things that we're all very mindful of is that we can talk about the interventions in the way that harmful content is either shut down if it is extremist or considered violent in nature, and how quickly we can respond to that. We can talk about whether or not algorithms lead people into dangerous places. But one of the really insightful comments from UNESCO was, how do we better equip users, our young people in particular, a new generation of users, to have the skill set that when they encounter radical information or content, or they encounter disinformation, they have the skills to deal with that in the online world. So we also, as a core community, have been thinking about that space too, because we will continue this expansive piece of work, but ultimately what we want are citizens themselves who are resilient in an online world, and I think that would then deal with some of the other issues that you talk around the proliferation of content.
And we will just give our international colleagues a chance to submit some questions by going straight to another one from the room. Derek Cheng, New Zealand Herald.
Several jurisdictions, including the UK, EU, Australia and New Zealand, have looked to strengthen their domestic laws to make online platforms more legally accountable for the content they host, something you yourself, Prime Minister, talked about in the aftermath of the terrorist attack. The major tech companies are based in the US, so what does the US membership of the call mean, if anything, for strengthening their domestic laws in this regard, given how they are currently their current laws give them legal immunity in this regard? Or is the US membership simply lip service, also given President Joe Biden's absence on the virtual summit call today?
Well, to your second part of the question, I would say no. You know, we were really pleased to have in recent weeks the official commitment of the US by them joining the call, but actually their engagement all the way through since it was initiated has been really consistent. What I would say on regulation would be twofold. First of all, as I've already touched on, it is not the only tool that we have, and the reason the call exists is an acknowledgement that regulation is not the only tool, and in some cases actually may not be sufficient in terms of the speed of response that we need and how comprehensive we need our responses to be. Secondly, on whether or not the limitation, the call will be limited simply by the activity of one country or not. In fact, the reason we have the call community is acknowledgement that regardless of where you may be domiciled, the impact of our tech companies and their reach is global. And so actually, yes, regulatory frameworks in individual countries matter. The call speaks to that. But then it's up to individual countries to then assert how they will implement that in country. But that does not remove the obligation of tech companies who sign up to fulfil the commitments of the call, regardless of where they're domiciled. And so I do not see regulation as a limitation, or variation in regulation as a limitation, or a removal of the expectations that we have as a core community.
Great.
Final thing, of course, the US has a number of regulatory issues that it is continuing to work through in its domestic context. And I know historically, of course, I think stemming back to the 1990s, if I recall, they have a particular take on the way that platforms are treated as a publisher or not, but those ultimately will be issues for them, and I understand they're working through them.
Thank you very much. Next we have Kate Nicol-Williams from the room as well. And international media, do let us know in the DM chat if there are any difficulties getting questions through.
Or if you're just preferring to listen to the dialogue.
Prime Minister, 2 years on, are you happy with what has been achieved so far in terms of actual real tangible change online? And just coming further to one of the previous questions, how will we ever be able to achieve your aim of eliminating extremist content online when it grows in places that I cannot see joining something like this, such as Telegram or 4chan? How will we ever actually eliminate it there? What's your thoughts on that? You talked about de-radicalising some of those groups. How would you do that?
Yeah. On the last part of your question, you know, I hope that you will have heard in my other answers that actually, regardless of jurisdiction, we will continue to work with individual companies who have global reach, but also the work that we can do to create or support, you know, a generation that's really resilient in the face of, you know, misinformation, disinformation, which is, you know, is beyond, you know, just the brief of really the violent extremism we're looking at in the call, but just making sure that we have an eye to, you know, when content may slip through, because this is a big ask, when content may slip through, what are we doing to ensure we have resilient consumers as well? In terms of the success of the call, I don't think I necessarily at the time when we brought the call together would have imagined that 2 years on we would have seen the progress that we had and the ongoing commitment. We've seen changes in the terms of service, changes in the way that tech companies moderate. We've seen a change in the way that they use live streaming, many more barriers in place and protections in place to prevent something like what happened in Christchurch happening again. So I'm really heartened by that, but I'm equally heartened that we all recognise some of the complex areas where that we actually have the most potential for harm and good, we all remain committed to. So that work on algorithms, I'm positive that we can keep making progress there too.
And we do have a question in from Emily Birnbaum with Politico.
Hi, thank you so much for having this. I really appreciate it. So I just wanted to return to what you were saying. Do you believe that it's time for the U.S. to reform Section 230, the social media legal liability shield, as you were alluding to earlier? And if so, do you have any specific proposals on the kinds of reform that you're hoping for, advocating for? And second, I think we all just want to know a little bit more about what you mean when it comes to, like, how can the Christchurch call police private companies algorithms, and like what exactly you're hoping to, like, action items on algorithms for the next 15 months.
So on the issue of another country's domestic regulation or legislation, ultimately that is for them. So, and I say that as a general principle. You won't find me in the Christchurch call space, or indeed in any space, giving a running commentary on the domestic legislation of another country. However, I come back to the fact that regardless, we have the core commitments, and that's really a good anchor for us to have that dialogue regardless of those regulatory decisions that are being made. And there I would say that I just hark back to a principle that I stood very firmly on right from the beginning. If you wanted to distill down what our ask is of tech companies, in many cases it would be that we ask them to do no more than uphold their terms of service. Because actually in that framework you see the kind of, the drive for ethical practice that we're really looking for, be it in content moderation or in terms of algorithmic outcomes. So those terms of service and ensuring that companies are better upholding those terms of service is a really key anchor for the call and the work that we're seeking. On algorithms, I'd refer you to, we are releasing the work program, and you can see in that we are looking for companies to really share more transparently algorithmic outcomes. That is really going to help us understand what is occurring without intervening or intercepting or disrupting proprietary issues, because we don't want that to be a barrier to us making progress in this area. We've had some conversation around how we can also enable community-led interventions, positive community-led interventions, how we can provide best practice on recommender systems, and again, that will rely on us having a better understanding of algorithmic outcomes. But again, you'll see from that work program, despite this being a contentious and complex area, we know where we want to hone in on as a community, and I see no reason why we can't make progress on those issues.
And thank you very much. That actually brings us to 30 minutes, so we will end it here. I want to thank all of you for joining us online. I want to thank the Prime Minister for giving us some time after the summit. There's no other international grouping of governments, companies and civil society doing this work in quite the way that the Christchurch call is, dealing with the issue of terrorist and violent extremist content online. So it is a very interesting area to be able to actually talk to you on. Thank you. There ends the broadcast. Haere rā, au revoir. Goodbye.
Ka kite.